Most of us were taught that we live in a universe made of these basic building blocks, like tiny universal Lego bricks. And I learned this week that goes all the way back to the 5th century BCE, where Greek philosophers came up with this idea that if you take a piece of matter and you cut it in half, and then you cut it in half again, and again, and again, and continued on until you couldn't cut anymore, then eventually you would reach something they called the uncuttable, the atomos, the atom, the divine Lego brick of the universe. It was only about 2,300 years later, with constantly evolving technology, that we actually found it, or at least evidence that such an atom existed. As it turned out, the Greeks were onto something. The universe was made of these uncuttable building blocks. Except they weren't entirely right. Because almost as soon as the atom came into scientific view, scientists also discovered that even the uncuttable atom could be cut. Now, I want to pause here and be clear. I am not a quantum physicist. I won't even pretend to have a handle on the bizarre things that happen when you go down to a subatomic quantum level. But what I do understand is this. As scientists cut deeper into the uncuttable, deeper into the basic structure of what all things really are, they didn't just find smaller and smaller solid building blocks. At a certain level, their best theories began describing things like fields and forces and interactions, things that exist and behave only in relationship with other things. Now that can get abstract, so let me put it this way. The deeper they looked, the less the universe resembled a pile of tiny, self-contained Lego bricks. And in fact, at the very foundation of things, reality begins to look less like isolated objects and more like patterns of interaction. And that changes things as far as how we understand what this universe is made of and how it works. Because here's what happens. When you start to zoom back out again, something shifts. You start to see that an atom isn't really this self-contained thing in and of itself, not in the solid, unchanging way that we thought. Instead, it's this dynamic system whose parts exist and behave through their relationships and interactions. Zooming out more, we see what is a molecule, but this collection of ever-shifting relationships between atoms. What are organs, but relationships between cells? What are humans, but the relationships between these organs and other humans? What are societies, but the relationships between us? And we can keep going, we can keep zooming out, and should, all the way out to the universe itself, which is, at its most fundamental essence, a collection of ever-shifting relationships between everything within it, including us. From the very smallest subatomic particles to the largest celestial body we can conceive, the basic essence of the universe is not a solid thing, but a process of relationship itself. And we're part of it. And that's where I want to start, with this foundation that we are fundamentally made in and through and of relationship. Because while this might have been news to pioneers of science, it's not news at all to pioneers of spirituality. Buddhists have long found their essence in what they call interdependent co-arising, and Christians have long circled around this idea of Trinity, that God is somehow not so much a thing, but the communion between Source and Son and Holy Spirit. And I think if we look at our experiences, we'll realize that there's something in us that knows this instinctively, because we are fundamentally drawn to relationship. That connection draws us. We long for it, and we feel the impact of isolation when we're out of it. Ecosystems and individuals alike depend on these networks of connection. And when those connections are damaged or thrown out of balance, we wither. This is stage one of all spirituality, I believe. That in the beginning, there is relationship. But this leads us to stage two, because it's not the whole story. We are fundamentally relationship, yes. And there is also something in us that resists. The story of evolution and natural selection isn't just a story of oneness and unity. It is a story of both cooperation and competition, of living things depending on one another, but also competing for resources and recognizing threats and adapting. You and I are here partly because living creatures developed this capacity to recognize difference. There is a self and there is an other. There is this deeply ingrained part of our programming that says we may be connected, but we are also separate. And some things that are out there might be a threat, so we should keep on our guard. So while relationship may be the basic building block of the universe, alongside relationship, we also find this force of self. And self is that which recognizes itself as separate from the other, which defines itself against the other. And that can sometimes, and often rightly, see the other as a threat. And because of self, relationship can get complicated. And that doesn't mean self is a bad thing. Like we just said, it was entirely necessary for us to survive and evolve. It's been a very useful tool. And as we talked about on Wednesday night, too little self can also be a dangerous and painful thing. But it can make things complicated. When there is one part of us that longs for this connection and unity, and another that's constantly asking, are you sure though? Are they safe? And we wind up living in this tension in between. And if we don't develop tools to balance and manage those forces, then suffering tends to follow. So that brings us to stage three. Because relationship is hard, and we have to negotiate these forces of difference, we build structures to help us. Once I had a friend who was in this chaplaincy cohort, and the cohort was tense. Relationship was a primary value of everybody in the group, but at the same time, they were so caught in these forces of difference that they really struggled. Southern Baptists and humanists had a hard time respecting how one another showed up in this work. More emotionally cautious students had a hard time with the boisterous extroverts in the group. And as a result, there were a few fights. And trying to negotiate these forces so they could stay in a healthy relationship, the educator introduced this tool, this framework. It was a sentence with blanks in it. And if students wanted to talk to each other, they would have to do so by using this sentence and filling in the blanks. And the sentence went like this: when I see you blank, I feel blank, because my value of blank is not being reflected. And so I'd like to ask you to blank. She even gave them a wheel of feelings and values that they could reference if they were having a hard time. And it worked, mostly. Whereas a student might have once said, "You're always telling people what to do," they could now say, "When I see you giving me advice, I feel frustrated, because my value of autonomy is not being reflected. And so I'd like to ask you to ask me questions instead." Or what was once, "You never contribute anything," could become, "When I see you staying silent in conversation, I feel isolated, because my value of connection isn't being reflected. So I'd like to ask you to be more honest about what you're thinking." And with this framework, those complicated forces of difference could find a scaffold to do the hard work of negotiating needs, and everyone could find their way back into the connection that they fundamentally wanted. That we are all fundamentally There's a sentence in there I can't quite get out, but you understand what I'm saying. Building the right frameworks to navigate these forces of self can do wonders. Now, that's on a small scale. On a bigger scale, we need bigger frameworks. Religion, politics, society, institutions. At their best, the roles we play, political identities we claim, and religious practices we value were created to help guide us in that difficult work of living in relationship. These frameworks give us scripts that we can rehearse to help us find the right words for repentance and repair. They can give us rituals we need to stay in the same room together. They can give us roles to play, to negotiate responsibility, or practices to negotiate needs and power. These frameworks can be invaluable in helping us navigate the fears and needs of the self, to help us foster the relationship and connection that we long for. And here's where it gets complicated again. Because that brings us to stage 4. Rather than serve the work of relationship, these frameworks can just as easily become distractions. Imagine a fire pit. The point of a fire pit is to create a safe space in which fire can burn, to protect it from the wind so it can survive, to prevent sparks from escaping so it doesn't become dangerous. A fire pit is a framework for the work of making fire. It also gives us a framework to socialize, to gather around and connect. But at the same time, how easy is it to focus so much on the fire pit that the work of making fire is neglected? How easy is it to focus on which stones look best? What kind of metal ring will look like the one we saw on Pinterest? What chairs around it will make it look really good from our back window? How easy is it to focus so much on these things that we rarely get around to the work of inviting people over and making a fire, using the fire pit for the framework it was meant to be? And the same is true of religion, of politics, of institutions, of any framework that we create. Over time, it's so easy to begin serving the framework instead of focusing on the connection the frameworks were meant to foster and guide. We can so easily start to use these frameworks to reduce others to categories, to justify ourselves, to avoid the real work of relationship. The late theologian and activist Walter Wink had this great way of talking about this. In his work, The Powers That Be, he points out that every institution has a certain purpose it was designed to carry out, that they are frameworks for a particular goal. Corporations, for example, were designed to help develop and distribute products that meet certain needs. Nations were designed to help us organize and negotiate representation to distribute power. And as they go about this work, these institutions can create a kind of energy, a kind of spirit that is greater than the sum of its parts. And Wink points out that ancient Israelites would call this spirit the institution's angel. Every nation had one, had an angel, a representative in the heavenly court. However, if a nation forgot its purpose, if it put the welfare of the people aside and began serving only itself, its self-centered ends of survival or domination or growth for growth's sake, then its angel would fall. No longer would it be considered an angel, but a demon. And the same is true of institutions, of groups, of practices. And I don't think it would be difficult for any of us in here to come up with examples of demonic institutions by Wink's definition. And our work, he argues, is the same as that of prophets and exorcists, to call these institutions back to their original purpose. Not to distract us from the work of relationship or serve only the self, but remember their place as frameworks meant to foster connection, fire pits meant to make fire and warmth. The frameworks can easily become distractions to hide from the real work of connection. And that brings us to the final stage. Stage 5. To go back to stage 1. To remember that in the beginning, we are fundamentally relationship. To remember that self makes that tricky, and to put those frameworks back into perspective. And that's where we come to this morning's text. Teaching in his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is addressing this large crowd of people, very familiar with the structures and frameworks created by their tradition, their priests, their ancient laws. Many of them have been told that the point is to serve the framework. That to be good and to earn God's approval, they have to be faithful enough in serving that structure. To not kill, to offer their gifts at the altar. And to them, Jesus says this: "You have heard it said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you, if you're angry with a neighbor, you will be liable to that same judgment. And if you even insult a neighbor, you will be liable to the council. Because it's not about serving the law. It's about fulfilling the law by loving your neighbor." And he says, when you're offering your gift at the altar, if you remember your neighbor has something against you, leave your gift and go. First be reconciled with your neighbor, then worry about coming and offering your gift. Because it's not about serving the ritual for the ritual's sake. It's about fulfilling the ritual through love. And in this, I can hear echoes of the prophets that came before him, preaching to ancient Israel about the same thing, serving the frameworks over the real work of connection that brings justice. I despise your festivals, the prophet Amos preached. And I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I won't accept them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. If I speak in the tongues of humans and angels, but I don't have love, Paul would write years later, I am a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. If I give away all my possessions and hand my body over so I may boast, but I don't have love, then I have nothing. The way that we follow isn't just meant to regulate outward behavior. To stop there puts the focus entirely on laws and frameworks and misses the true purpose. Because the real point of this framework, this whole thing, is to transform our hearts from which relationship arises. This is all a fire pit meant to foster a flame. The work of relationship is difficult. It is so much easier to hide behind roles and rituals and institutions and ideas. It can be easier to use them to avoid vulnerability, even when that framework was meant to help us be brave. But God, when we do that, do we miss so much? The deepest desire of our heart is to lean into that connection that we most fundamentally are. And when we avoid that work, we wither. Jesus' call here, I believe, is to have courage. To use these frameworks to create brave space in which we can live more fully into what we really are. And in so doing, have a more abundant and connected life. And so, as always, that brings us to this question. Where do we see ourselves in this? What is the invitation for you or for us? Where might we be hiding behind the frameworks meant to point beyond themselves? And where is the challenge to heed the call? Where is the sometimes difficult work of relationship calling us? Because to answer that call is to move closer to our source and to become more fully what we really are. So for the next few minutes, as Jake plays, let's make some space to see what rises to the surface There are prompts in your liturgy guide if that's helpful, or you can just close your eyes and see what nudges you feel. But before we prepare to approach the altar this morning, let's follow Jesus' advice in this text and look inward. What is our invitation this morning?